In this tantalizing video, we'll be taking a look at how to render out shadows for Maya lights. Shadows are extremely important in lighting because they give you a sense of weight and composition. We'll go ahead and start with our key light and we'll create ourselves a spotlight. We'll go to 7 so we can see what's going on. I'll turn on the special manipulator, which is the T key, and I'll move the target as I place my light. Makes it a little bit easier than moving and rotating manually. There we go. If we take a look at the camera view in 7 mode, and we'll do a quick render. Now the render comes out without any shadows, which looks, odd. You don't get a sense of contact, you don't get a sense of weight and actual physicality. For shadows to be rendered out, we'll need to go into the Shadows attribute editor. Here we'll find a tab, or I should say a heading called Shadows, allowing us 2 different types of shadows: depth map shadows and ray trace shadows. We'll go ahead and take a look at depth map shadows first. We'll just turn that on and we'll put this in the buffer and hit render, and bada bing bada boom, you've got shadows. This really helps the feeling of a solid composition because it really grounds the objects. With the depth map shadow, we're writing out maps that place the shadows into the rendered image. And you can see there's some rough edges with these maps. That can be changed by upping the resolution. Let's go ahead and double our resolution. I'll put this in the buffer and render this frame. And you'll see we're starting to get cleaner edges. Depth map shadows, at least in my own personal experience, are something that I haven't used in quite some time. I much rather prefer ray trace shadows. Now with ray trace shadows, you have to enable ray tracing in the renderer itself. My software rendering by default does not have ray tracing turned on. So if you open up the render settings window, which is also known as the render globals from Maya versions in the past, us old-timers still refer it to as render globals. We'll go ahead and go into the Maya software tab, and we will go under ray tracing quality heading and just simply turn on ray tracing. That's all we need to do to enable ray tracing. If you're rendering in Mental Ray, it is turned on by default. Now, I will go ahead and let's see, we already have ray trace shadows turned on. I'll go save this depth map shadow in our buffer, and I'll go ahead and render our scene. One of the added things we'll get when we turn on ray tracing, because I'm using blends and fongs for these objects, is reflections. But that's for a different rendering topic lesson altogether. Let's stay focused on the shadows. If I scrub back and forth, you'll notice that the quality and the crispness of the shadows are far superior in ray tracing than they are in the depth mapping. The depth mapping may be faster. You'll see that there's a slight render hit. We go from 2 seconds to 3 seconds. When you're talking much larger scenes, a 50% increase is quite sizable. However, it's not really a 50% increase. It's going to be much smaller depending on your scene. Ray trace shadows are really where it's at. It's really quite remarkable. One thing we'll do is we'll turn up the light radius on that light. Let's just take it all the way up to 2. And I'll put this in the buffer and I will render out the scene now. What the light radius has done, it has taken the shadows that are being ray traced and drastically softened them, creating this sort of dithered, stippled look. This is because its quality is still set low. If we increase shadow rays, let's say to a value of 8, and then save this in the buffer and render that, you'll get a much longer render time, but you'll get much more photo accurate shadows. That's a low res, that's a nice high res. Let's remove this one from the buffer and let's scrub between the old ray trace shadow with a light radius of 0 and the new with a light radius of 2. This has a far more realistic shadow fall off and a far more realistic effect for your renders. It's simple, however, there is a bit of a render hit. We've gone from about 3 seconds with a 0 radius to 10 seconds with a 2 radius and a rays of 8. The higher your light radius, the higher your shadow rays should be for quality. You can still see a little bit of stippling towards the corners here. However, this is quite acceptable and it looks pretty nice. If you want a cleaner, you want to increase your shadow rays. Going too high on the light radius and your shadows will look way too soft and way too mushy. So you want to find the right balance of render speed to radius and rays. These settings are true for most other light types, so let's go ahead and change this to a directional light. Now rendering this light with shadows usually works best when you're using ray tracing on a directional light. Let's put this in the buffer. We have a light angle. Let's set that back to 2. That seems to have reset when we change the light type, and we'll go ahead and render this out and we'll see a very different result and a much slower render. Spotlights tend to ray trace their shadows much nicer and have a much nicer fall off. You can see a little bit of fall off here at the edges. Let's put this in the buffer and take our light angle all the way down to 0 so we have a point of comparison between an angle of 2 and an angle of 0 on a directional light. Once this finishes rendering, we'll take a look and scrub back and forth. Now we can scrub back and forth between a light radius of 2 and a light radius of 0. As you can see with a directional light, you will have a much higher light angle number to get as soft shadows as we had with our spotlight. Again, these are both a light angle of 2 and a shadow rays of 8. Keep in mind, if you increase your light angle for a directional light, you'll also have to increase the shadow rays for quality, and your render times will go up quite a bit. So in short, directional lights and soft shadows with the ray tracing, not the greatest of ideas, however they can be done, and you end up with a much more subtle fall off than you do with a spotlight with a light radius. Now let's change this light just for fun to a point light. We'll see that the shadow attributes are still set to ray tracing. We have a nice light radius. Let's go ahead and render this. Now, of course, the proximity of the light to the objects also will dictate how soft the light will be, but also how soft the shadowing will be. You'll see with a point light, quite different than a directional. Let's remove this from the buffer. And we go back and forth between the spotlight and the point light. And we get fairly similar results when it comes to the foreground objects, but you get much more light from the point light because it's casting across this whole area where the spotlight stops at this. In this video, we took a look at how to render shadows with the lights, taking a look at depth map shadows very briefly, and then spending a little bit more time and focus on ray trace shadows and how to soften your ray trace shadows by using light radius and shadow rays.